To another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing the Alabama Roll Tide. And, I figured it would be necessary for them to come up because I was thinking to myself, I wanted to kind of start a series on head coaches who, are under the most pressure to win right now. And one of the names that immediately kind of came in my mind was Kalen Deboer for a couple of reasons. I think first and foremost, I think a lot of the expectations that we're seeing on Kalen Deboer are definitely a little bit exaggerated for a couple of good reasons. I think one, you have to contend with the legacy of Nick Saban. Obviously, for the past 17, 18 seasons, he's been kicking ass and taking names, and is an all-time great, and that's a hard legacy to kind of to build on, because there's just so much pressure there in and of itself. But I would say outside of Nick Saban, he pretty much anywhere he's ever coached, he's won. We just did the episode on Jeff Tedford a couple days ago, and he had his first stint at Fresno State in between the two stints with Jeff Tedford. He was there 2020 to 2021, and then he was at Washington for a couple seasons. So it just kind of, even when the job did open up, Kalen Deboer was probably the most obvious candidate, other than Lane Kiffin was probably the most other obvious one that we could really sort of think of. But I would say going into this year, I think everybody obviously, the standard is obviously a national title every year. And with the expanded 12-team playoff, I think there really is a strong shot for them to, I wouldn't say, I'm not saying they're going to get a bye or anything, but, it's not completely outlandish to sit there and say, hey, they might pull up with, 10 wins, get into the first round, maybe lose there. But I would say, there's a lot of change with this program in general. I think there were approximately over 40 new players coming. They've lost over 40 players combined with the transfer portal, and also, with the NFL draft too, because, you got to see that every year. Every year, Alabama always has at least, 6 to 10 guys being drafted. So contending with that while also, building depth on the roster, but at the same time, a lot of these bigger programs understand that, hey, a lot of these backups might not sit there for 2 or 3 seasons when you can go to either a smaller Power 4 school or a big group of 5 school and get playing time right away. So that's one of the things that I think as a big program you're always kind of contending with, which is why a lot of the bigger schools, i.e. USC, Ohio State, you see a lot of those schools really kind of, really implementing and using the transfer portal a lot more than, some of the smaller schools where they know that their bread and butter ultimately really is high school recruiting. And so when I think about Alabama year one, I think the biggest question mark for me is really just going to be, how do you maximize Jalen Milroe? I think that's ultimately really what's going to make the difference between Alabama possibly winning 8 to 9 wins this year versus the 10 or 11. I think the defense, for the most part, has always been consistent, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on the defensive side of the ball in a moment. But I'd say sticking with the offensive side of the ball, obviously he loses his longtime coordinator, Ryan Grubb, to the NFL, who, he was with Washington before and then went to the NFL. And he replaced him with one of his other staff members at Washington, Nick Sheridan, who was, I believe, his tight end coach. But I think he also, led Indiana's offense for a little bit at a time too. So I think the biggest thing, obviously, is, now that I'm kind of thinking about it, there is definitely a big contrast between Michael Penix versus Jalen Milroe in terms of their skill set. I'm not saying Jalen Milroe doesn't have an arm, and I'm not saying he, can't make those big throws, but I think, to me, the biggest difference about Milroe is I think you're going to have to really take advantage of those RPO opportunities, those designed runs, And I think you're going to have to kind of, I guess for a lack of a better word, simplify it. And I'm not even saying simplify as an insult. I'm saying simplify in the sense that I don't think Jalen Milroe, to maximize Jalen Milroe, I don't think it's best for him to kind of be in an air raid offense where he's passing 30 or 40 times a game. I think you have to get somewhere closer to that 20 to 25 and, get those design runs in there, but at the same time, you you want to really limit those big hits, particularly when he's on the run and he's trying to make those plays out of the pocket. Now, I think, you know, one thing it could also kind of lead up to, since, we saw Michael Penix last year with Washington, is, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some more deep ball opportunities from them. Now, I don't think we saw as much of that last year with Alabama, but if you ask me, the two things that I anticipate being a lot different is I think we're going to see more RPO. I think we're going to see some more read options, some screens. I think just really just kind of just getting Milroe kind of in a rhythm, and also just kind of making sure that we're really kind of maximizing that athleticism too. Because out of all the things that I will give Kalen Deboer credit for, is that he has been a consistent winner and he understands the offensive side of the ball and he knows how to maximize the players that he has. And, you know, don't get me wrong, Jalen Milroe, 100%, I'd be very happy if I had him. I think last year there were a lot more questions with him because I think people, were just kind of reluctant because you think of kind of the previous quarterbacks that Alabama has. I mean, obviously, you know, going from Jalen, obviously being in Jalen Hurts' shoes, that's a lot of pressure. And then, you think of the past Alabama quarterbacks, and they all kind of have the same sort of similar mold. So for Jalen Milroe to, kind of step in those shoes, it's a big deal for him. But what really is one big positive for him is he has a lot of offensive weapons to work with. You know, I did watch his interview with Adam Brentman, and he comes off as incredibly humble, motivated, driven, and he just quite frankly just seems like a leader. So I think all of those kind of character things, I think he is just become a natural at. But at the same time, you know, the more spotlight is going to be on him this year because this really is kind of his team, and he's going to be the face for the team. So I'm excited to see how that's going to turn out. But I would anticipate those kind of being the biggest changes on the offensive side of the ball. And in terms of the defensive side of the ball, obviously everybody knows Nick Saban's one of the greatest when it comes to defense over the past 17, 18 seasons in college football. Now, they did bring in Kane Wommack, who before was the head coach of South Alabama, and he stepped down at South Alabama to come coach defense over here. Now, for those of you who don't know about Kane Wommack, he's a brilliant young mind. I will be the first one on the show to say that in 5 to 10 years from now, we're going to be talking about him in the same vein that we're talking about Kalen Deboer and Ryan Day and Sharon Moore. I'm telling you, this guy's legit. Every place I've seen him, boom, 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 electric, exciting to watch. And even South Alabama last year, I'm pretty sure they won 8 or 9 games last year. And when I think I think the game, particularly on the coaching side, has always kind of been leaning a little bit towards the younger side. But I think this is one of those coaches where I see how he is. I've watched his other teams. I see how he conducts himself in the press conferences, and to me, he just seems like a winner. And to me, it's a brilliant hire from him. I understand that he is going to want to bring in his own guys, and there's always going to be some criticism of, well, it's just the Kalen DeBoer guy. Can he really handle that? But at the same time, I mean, nobody's going to sit there and say that going from South Alabama to Alabama isn't an upgrade. This is literally the biggest moment of his career, and he has really every opportunity to kind of make this work too. And also, they have history together when when Kalen Deboer was the offense was over at Indiana too. So it's not like these guys have only coached for a season together. But at the same time, I guess what I'm most curious about in terms of the transition from kind of the Nick Saban led defense to Kane Wommack is how much different is it? How much different is it going to be? I think when you kind of when you really kind of sit there and think about it, I think Womack's going to kind of tweak a little bit of the defense to kind of resemble a little bit more of kind of the you know 3-4 sort of system that we've seen from Saban in the past. But also at the same time too, with all the different coordinators that he's had over the years, I think he's also kind of trended a little bit more towards like the 4-2, 4-2-5 kind of thing too, which I'm not saying isn't a bad thing. I'm just saying in general, it's one of those things where, when you have all these different changes between the transfer portal and the new coordinators and everything like that, everybody, like, just because of Nick Saban, everybody kind of likes to jump the gun and say, well, if they don't win 10 or 11 games this year, then it's just a failed season. And, I'm going to be here to tell you that I think 8 or 9 is a little bit more realistic. And quite frankly, if I was an Alabama fan, I think you should be happy with 9 wins. And, even when we take a look at their schedule, the top half of the schedule isn't super brutal. I mean, you have a couple cupcakes against Western Kentucky and South Florida. Wisconsin's always one of those teams where, they're going to be under the radar this year, but it's never easy to play there. But should be able to make it out of that game. Yeah, they should. And then I think this is really where it kind of gets a little hairy. So they are going to be hosting Georgia September 28th. Okay, then you got Lafford versus Vanderbilt. South Carolina, I mean, they're always tough, but I mean, Shane Beamer in South Carolina, they're not at Alabama's level right now, so that should be a win. And then look at this, brutal 3-game stretch here. You have Tennessee. You're going to Tennessee, then you're hosting Missouri, then you're going to Death Valley and LSU. So, I mean, to me, I think really where it kind of starts the test for them is, I think Alabama can afford to lose the Georgia game, even though that they're home. I would say to me the big test is when, I'm looking at this Alabama Tennessee game. When I see that game, I'm asking myself, how much is this team really kind of gelling together with all the new portal? There's just so many questions in terms of all the new faces there, and for the most part, they really didn't get that generous of a schedule either. Because I mean, they also do have to go to Oklahoma towards the end of the year, and obviously you always have the Iron Bowl, which if it wasn't for some fairy tale 4th and 24 pass, we wouldn't have been talking about them in the college playoff last year. Nick Saban would have retired and walked off to the sunset and didn't even have a chance to even come anywhere near it. He would have, maybe been in the SEC championship game, and that probably would have been it. But back to Kalen Deboer, I think Alabama right now, they have all the tools and all the resources that they could possibly need to, for the transition between Saban and DeBoer to go smooth. I think what it really comes down to is how do you maximize Jalen Milroe? How do you make sure that Alabama's winning in the trenches? And I think also how do you make sure that the general Crimson Tide fan base doesn't, as soon as you see a little bit of struggle, how do you make sure that those expectations are kind of appropriate and people aren't jumping the gun as soon as Kalen Deboer, what if there's a random upset versus a Wisconsin or a Missouri or something. So I think how do you kind of tame those expectations, but also how do you make sure that ultimately the bar needs to be set high. I mean, there's no question. Every year it needs to be every year the expectation is SEC championship and a national title. But I think at least for the first year or two, I think we have to cool the jets a little bit and say to ourselves, "Hey, if he can walk away with a 10-2 season, I'd be pretty freaking happy if I was an Alabama fan."